Political reporter. Well, let's get now the thoughts of the former Conservative Brexit Secretary, David Davis, who's a great friend of this programme. David, morning to you.
Morning.
You were the first Tory MP to raise this Prime Minister's questions, naming Nigel Farage. You knew right away, how many weeks ago that was, that there was a really bad smell about all of this.
Yes, that's right. In fact, Nigel's not the first case of this that has come to my attention, but previous ones I've not been able to publicise because they're private citizens. They don't want their lives ruined by being told, the whole world being told that they can't have a bank account. So this has been going on for some time, and Nigel's done a service really to the whole country in dragging it into the public domain. Because what's happening here is you have these people, these senior bank managers. They are essentially bureaucrats. They're not really wealth creators. They are people who administer things on behalf of the taxpayer. And they are using their positions to exercise their own views, their own prejudices to other people's disadvantage. And that's absolutely wrong. And it used to be that they thought, well, you don't have an absolute right to a bank account. Well, in this day and age, if you take away somebody's bank account, you're almost taking away their ability to operate in modern society. You can't even order a train ticket or whatever. So there's a real big problem here. It needs to be resolved. There's actually more than one. I mean, what Nigel's been talking about this morning is the breach of his privacy, the breach of his the confidentiality of his bank account, which you would have thought was absolute. The banks are not allowed to talk about your account to anybody other than the tax authorities and the police and the anti-fraud authorities. They can't talk to anybody else about it, and yet this lady has done. And so that's one part. The other part is simply this question of disqualifying people from accounts. I mean, I think this is a huge story. I think it's going to turn out to be tens of thousands of people have lost their accounts, care of the prejudices of their banks.
And that's the point, isn't it? I mean, Nigel Farage, his political views cost him his bank account. It's like banks are now operating like political regimes and he's some form of activist. But, David, isn't it all the more astonishing that it was the chief executive, no less, of the bank who's paid £5.5 million a year, apparently a woman who's had a stellar career in banking, who thought it was OK to gossip at a dinner to the BBC business editor about the private financial affairs of any citizen, let alone somebody as high profile as Nigel Farage?
Well, I agree. It is astonishing. I mean, it shocked me when I first heard it. But I'm afraid there is a class of people in Britain who view people like Nigel as second-class citizens, beyond the pale in some. And that's what's going on here, I'm afraid. They wouldn't have done the same, I don't know, with Greta Thunberg or somebody. No. But Nigel is another camp, and it was thought to be OK to do it. I mean, disgraceful in my view, and actually really quite surprising that she tried to hang on. I mean, as soon as I heard it last night, was it 5, 6 o'clock last night? I said this won't last. It won't go because this is a breach of the most fundamental duty your bank manager owes you.
David, does
owe you the right to keep your affairs secret.
On that question, let me just ask you, why then was what you just said, this was a fundamental breach? Why was the NatWest chairman, Sir Howard Davis, saying, as early as yesterday afternoon, that she had the full support of the board?
Well, the difficulty with the British establishment sometimes is they all have a sort of groupthink. And there is a problem. I mean, when I end up defending people, very often I end up defending people who are unpopular, and very often I end up defending people who've got completely opposite views to me. But generally speaking, when people are talking about some ill being done, some crime being done, some offence being done against somebody, they get much more upset when it's somebody like them, and much less upset when it's somebody from an opposing camp. I'm trying to think. Let's say it was Jeremy Corbyn. You might feel a bit less sympathetic than if it was Nigel Farage. But I take the view that they all have fundamental rights. Unfortunately, the British establishment doesn't work that way. That's why we have rules. That's why we have laws. That's why we have principles and conventions. But unfortunately, sometimes I think people ignore that when they're making judgments, saying, "Oh, we don't like that person. We'll put up with it," or "It's not quite so bad because it's somebody we don't like." Well,
David,
it's a massive.
We've been talking about her 5.5 million salary. Is it conceivable, now that she's resigned, she will get a payoff? Because that would be unthinkable, wouldn't it? A woman whose bank is 39% owned by the public getting an obscene payoff for incompetence.
Well, I would ask you to consider what would happen if, instead of being the chief executive of NatWest, she was a clerk in the local bank, in the days when we had local banks anyway, and she had done this. How much of a payoff do you think she would have got then?
Nothing.
And the answer is nil. She'd been on the doorstep, straight out the door. And I think the same should apply here. This is, frankly, it's a gross misconduct in terms of the standards of banking that I would expect anyway. And so I wouldn't expect a payoff at all. I mean, I've got no doubt within a few months you'll go and find some other comfortable berth. I don't think, if you lose your job because you've made a sizable error of decision, and this is not dropping a ball. This is a real, serious, deliberate mistake. Then you shouldn't get payoffs. And I'm afraid I don't approve of the sort of modern payoff culture where your payoff is in proportion to your salary. No, I'm afraid your absence of payoff should be in proportion to the size of the mistake. And this is a whopping great mistake. It's gossiping about somebody who you don't approve of. Well, I'm afraid that's a misuse of your power.
David, we've just heard, it's just come out on the wires, that Number 10 have announced that Dame Alison Rose is no longer a member of the Prime Minister's Business Council, which will hurt, of course, because there was photographs of her only a couple of weeks ago in the Downing Street Rose Garden, looking all pally with Rishi Sunak. This was just, of course, before the proverbial hit the fan.
Yeah, of course. And he's right about that. What was interesting, I mean, I wasn't aware of Number 10's view, and indeed the other cabinet members' view, and until quite late last night. But I think they did respond quickly and effectively, and they did the right thing. I mean, I tried to call Number 10, but I couldn't get through. Sometimes it's difficult if you've got other things going on. But they've made the right decision, and they should stick to it, and they should make sure. I mean, bear in mind, look, senior bankers are essentially bureaucrats. They're not wealth creators. Remember that. They are administrators. They get paid an awfully large sum of money. Simply, we haven't got our money back yet. The reason we got 37% or whatever it is of the shares is because the taxpayer hasn't been paid back for all the funding we sank into this industry because of their mistakes back in the Gordon Brown days, back in the 2000 to 2010. So, I think that we should be quite tough on them. It's entirely right to say she shouldn't be an advisor to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister doesn't need advice from people who take such a prejudicial view of the world, I'm afraid.
And just finally, David, and very briefly, because we're under pressure on time, Nigel Farage is gunning for more. Should the chief executive of Coutts Bank itself, Mr. Flavor, go, or even the managing director, Camilla Stoll, who looked after Nigel's bank account and was a Remainer and was pretty hostile to him from the beginning?
Whoever was responsible for the original decision, I think their job's at risk. I'm not quite with Nigel trying to wipe out the entire senior management of Coutts and NatWest. And he's an ambitious lad, but I think that's a bit too far. But whoever was actually responsible, and that's what we need. We need the proof. We need somebody to look and say, who made this decision? I mean, that 40-page document was a bloody disgrace. Yeah. And there's no other way of putting it, And whoever commissioned that, whoever put up with that, whoever allowed it to happen, whoever initiated it, and whoever completed it. That's the person whose job should be really at risk. Frankly, as a salutary lesson to the entire banking industry, who also ought to have to go through their files and see whose bank accounts they've shut down. And at the end of this, I suspect next year, we're going to be actually giving people, if not the right to a bank account, the right to a proper adjudication. If a bank terminates them for anything other than a strict economic reason. Sure, if I can't pay my bills, then my bank should be able to shut my account down. But if I pay my bills and do everything else within the normal rule of financial requirements, my opinions shouldn't matter at all. It doesn't matter what they are. And anybody who tries to do that in future should run into something quite difficult in the way of adjudication process.
David, thank you for telling it as it is, as ever. That's the former Brexit Secretary and Tory MP, David Davis, who led the charge in the Commons at that first Prime Minister's questions.